Huh? Well, generally, Lent is supposed to represent Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, 40 days. So Jesus fasted 40 days in the wilderness. So most people that celebrate Lent give up something for 40 days, whatever that might be. I gave up coffee one year for 40 days. It was actually kind of a bet because the girl that bet me to give up coffee for 40 days during Lent, I made her give up Facebook for 40 days during Lent. So anyway, but anyhow, we are in Ezra. Ezra returning to Jerusalem to rebuild the altar, meeting his over a 20-year period here, leading the captives back and letting them inhabit once again the city of Jerusalem. So it's a pretty substantial time in the history of Israel, this time of return. It's during the time of Xerxes. That's the reason we took that little break for Esther, because this actually transpired over the course of several kings. So there was a period of time involved, 20 years. Kings came into power, kings went out of power. Darius the first is probably the king we're most familiar with. He was the Mede king in the book of Daniel. And then also Xerxes is probably the one we're most familiar with because of the book of Esther. Xerxes is the king, and Xerxes was quite the military guy. He really was quite incorporated Greece into the Greek War, where he had kind of incorporated Greece into the Medo-Persian Empire. Of course, the Grecian Empire, well, Alexander the Great will conquer all this from the Medes eventually. We're not that far yet historically. We're about 400 years before Christ, 400 and a little probably before Christ at this particular time in the Bible. So a lot's going to go on in that 400-year period. This is speaking about, now that we're in Ezra 7, this is talking about him going. Of course, Nehemiah, which we'll look at Nehemiah Sunday morning. Nehemiah kind of runs with Ezra. Nehemiah rebuilt the wall. We're way bigger on Nehemiah than we are in Ezra, because there's a lot of sermons preached on Nehemiah about building the wall. You hear about Nehemiah a lot. In the Hebrew Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah is one book. It's not two separate books. It really kind of encompasses the same thing. Ezra goes back to rebuild the temple. Nehemiah goes back to rebuild the wall. The interesting thing about both these men is that God never really tells either one of them to go do it. It isn't one of them things where God says, go do this, They just more or less, the time comes, the situation arises, the opportunity arises, they see a need. I think that's one of the reasons I kind of admire these guys, because they kind of took the initiative, even on their own, to say this is what needs to be done, it's the right thing to do. God doesn't have to come down and say, go do this. We know we need to do it, and we're in a position to do it, and we have the favor of the king, so we're going to do these things. So I think that's one thing we see. A lot of names that don't mean a lot to us, but they did mean a lot historically, a lot to the people. And when this book was written, it has a lot of things about it. The ones who are left, the ones that want to come back, not all of them did come back, obviously. A lot of them stayed. That's because Esther, right? Esther, we talked about Esther. Esther, those were people who didn't go back. They didn't want to go back. They could have went back to Jerusalem. They chose not to do that. They had been 70 years. 70 years they'd been in captivity by the time that Ezra returns. 70 years. So that's, generations. People are born in different cities. They have their jobs there, their occupation, their houses. They didn't want to go back. So a lot of them didn't. These are the ones who did, wanted to go back to Jerusalem. And Ezra is kind of the leader of that. He came to Jerusalem the 5th month, 7th year of the king. So if you kind of put that with Esther, this is right at the time of Esther. For in that concurrent time, for on the 1st of the month, he began to go up from Babylon. He came to Jerusalem. So you can see the 1st month he began to go up, and on the 1st of the 5th month he came. So that gives you an idea. About 4 months journey to get to Jerusalem. So sometimes we read these books and we think in our minds how fast things are today and how we go from one place to another. But these were periods of a lot of miles, I think about 680 miles, something like that, with a group of people on foot. That's a pretty good journey. 680 miles on foot's a pretty good trek. So on that, and we'll get into that a little bit. The fear of what they had all this wealth with them. It says, if you look here, he came to Jerusalem because the good hand of his God was upon him. So a lot of times in these books we see God's favor, God's providence, God's will, but not direct intervention of God. And I think that's something that, boy, it's a little bit different. You know, we talk about providence of God, will of God, blessing of God. But this isn't a case in these books. You just don't see the prophet coming and saying, God's going to do this. God's going to do that. You need to go do this. These books don't revolve like that. It's a different time. God deals differently at different times with different people. You all agree with that? God doesn't always deal the same way with man. Oh, he never, And I think that's an important fact to think about. And there's a lot of people in the Old Testament, because we don't often think, a lot of times when we think of the Old Testament, we kind of think, well, it's about God telling people what to do, and they either do it or they don't. That's kind of the summary view of the Old Testament. And a lot of times we don't realize that even in the Old Testament, there were a lot of men and women who did great things because it was the right thing to do, because they were motivated by God's word, by the love of God, to do what they should do. And I think maybe those are the better stories in the Old Testament, instead of the ones where it says God says go do this or go do that, or I'm going to give you this. These are cases where I think man's desire to serve, man's desire to be godly, leads men to do, and women to do, great things. And this is kind of the case of this book. And great faith. And I think when you see the faith of Ezra, the faith of Nehemiah, it's great faith because, like I said, God's not speaking to them through a prophet and saying, oh, I'm going to take care of this. I'm going to do this. It's all good. Go do this. It's all going to be fine. They don't have that reassurance, from God that, yeah, this is all going to be good if you just go do it. They're relying on faith, right? Faith is what? It's the substance of things hoped for, the Hebrew writer says. The evidence of things not seen, right? Isn't that what the Hebrew writer says? Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And so faith moves them. Faith in God motivates them to think God's going to take care of this. If we do the right thing, we do our part, God's going to do his part. And so I think that's a big theme of these books. Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord and practice it and to teach his statutes and ordinances in Israel. It's a time of desertion of the law. And there's a lot of times in Israel's history, the law is so prevalent in Israel. It's all about the law, the law, the law, the law of Moses. The law says do that. The law, Gary was reading tonight in Matthew. What was Jesus quoting, right? The law says, or it is written, the ancients were told, right? I mean, these are all, whether it's oral tradition, written law, law of Moses, these words were binding and these words were known, and yet many times they got thrown to the back, they got lost. We saw the case in the Old Testament where the law actually got lost, misplaced, and they actually found it again. Times where God's people deviated from the law substantially and then came back to the law. And then you get a time here where it's kind of that case. Then captivity, they'd kind of deserted the law. They kind of got away from the law. There was no temple. There was no sacrifice. There was no priestly order to speak of. Synagogue worship prevailed. Things were different. And now that we're going back to the temple, we're going back to where we need to have the law. We're going back to Jerusalem. Now all of a sudden we need to know the law. We need to practice the law. We need to read the law. But then when they do this, as we see here in Nehemiah, when they do this, the law convicts them that a whole lot of the things they are doing are wrong. Right? And it's going to cause major disruption in a lot of areas because they realize that as they read the law, they realize how far they have drifted away from the law of God. So there's a lot of things going on, and these men are trying to bring them back. This is a copy of the decree. The scribe learned in the words and commandments of the Lord and the statutes to Israel, Xerxes, king of kings, to Ezra the priest, the scribe of the law of the God of heaven, perfect peace. I've issued a decree that any of the people of Israel and their priests and the Levites in any kingdom who are willing to go to Jerusalem may go. So it's a time of return. Decision. For as much as you are sent to Judah, Jerusalem, according to the law of your God, which is in your hand. So, why was going back to Jerusalem so important? Worship, right? Temple. I mean, that's where the temple is. This is where the temple has. There's no temple. You know, the temple's destroyed, but that's where God told them to worship. So, you got to go back, right? Can't build a temple in Babylon. Can't build a temple in, right, Syria. You got to build a temple at Jerusalem. Jerusalem, mountain of God, right? Moriah. So you got to be on the mount. So you've got the law. The king's saying you can go back. And he's giving you wealth, and we've talked about that. He's giving you wealth. He's going to give you silver and gold, and he's going to give you ability to get more money if you need it, to get more things if you need it. He says, you shall diligently buy bulls, rams, lambs, or grain offerings, drink offerings, offer them on the altar of the house of your God, which is in Jerusalem, because the altar by this point has been rebuilt. That's the first part of Ezra. Whatever seems good to you and your brothers, do with the rest of the silver and gold. Basically gives them that. Utensils they brought back from Babylon. I think it's interesting in this that he issues a decree to the treasurers beyond the river. That's beyond the Jordan. So he's got this big kingdom, and there's treasuries throughout this kingdom. That's how this has to work, right? Because they tax everybody. And so you got these treasuries beyond the river, which is the Jordan River. So it's between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. But you got to remember, beyond the river here is, you would think, the Jordan. The Jordan only goes from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea, right? It doesn't go all the way through there. So it's Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea to the Mediterranean, right? So it's on that side of the Jordan, basically is what he's saying, that side of the Jordan. And he says, to those priests, to give you basically beyond the river, whatever Ezra the priest, scribe of the law, may require of you, it shall be done diligently. So he's not only sending them with money, but he's giving the ability to get more supplies, more money, if it's needed, up to this amount. So the king has decreed they can get up to this amount from there. And then also he says, we're not going to charge you tax on all of your priests, Levites, singers, doorkeepers, Nethinim, are servants of this house of God. You, Ezra, according to the wisdom of your God that's in your hand, appoint magistrates, judges, that they may judge the people who are in the province beyond the river. So he says, we're not only going to send you with money, we're going to give you the ability to get money, and we're not going to tax you. So this is pretty big, pretty generous, right? Pretty generous offer that the king has bestowed upon them. So they've got everything in place to do it. The problem with them is they're just sluggish. You know, that's how come you have, Gary taught y'all, I think it was last Wednesday night, Zechariah, Haggai, Zechariah, right? Zechariah, you know. Those guys were prophets of God that God didn't call them to be prophets to say this is all going to work out good. God gave them as prophets to say, you need to get this done. Right? I mean, they were the prophets who were saying, get with the program. You know, it just needs to be finished. 20 years, long enough. You need to get this temple built. Right? 20 years is too long. You need to get this built. So, a lot of stuff going on, a lot of wealth, a lot of good stuff coming on. He says, even those who know the laws of your God may teach anyone who is ignorant. This is big. Don't think much about this. But it's big. Because, you know, if you really want to keep a people in submission, to a country, what do you teach them? What do we teach our children in school? Do we teach them how wonderful Canada is? Right? We teach them how wonderful America is, right? Isn't that what we do? We raise them up to be Americans, right? Do we throw a lot of propaganda at them, do you think, when it comes to the United States, when they're in grade school and middle school and high school? Well, you got to remember Esther's there, Mordecai, the Jews. No. But there's a lot of power of the Jews. I think God's hand was with them, and I think people knew who they were, and I think he knew, and he obviously knew who they were, and I think he wanted that God on his side. I mean, this wasn't for naught. He wasn't just doing this because he's like, I'm just a good guy, and I want you to go do what you want to do. He was doing this because he wanted to entreat the favor of God. I mean, the more gods he had on his side, the better it was. Don't think so. They're all polytheistic, Yeah, I don't think they ever really came to God over it. But this is a big thing because he's saying you can actually teach your people to be Jews instead of Persians, right? I mean, Darius wasn't that nice. Darius wanted to teach them all to be Babylonians, right? Isn't that what he wanted to do? Eat like Babylonians, talk like Babylonians, have names like Babylonians, walk like Babylonians, right? But this guy's saying, it's okay, go be Jews, right? As long as you pay your tax and you don't try to overthrow the kingdom, go be you, right? And that's a really big thing. Go teach your children, teach them. Whoever will not observe the law, let judgment be executed on him. And he gave them ability to enforce it, right? Because they're in another nation. This is a vassal state. I mean, they're not their own state. They're still in Persia. They're still part of that kingdom. The Romans sure didn't let them kill people. Well, they did, but they said they didn't, right? I mean, because Stephen got stoned, but Jesus, they had to go to the Romans to crucify him. The Romans would not allow them by law, by Roman law, they couldn't execute somebody. But in this case, he's saying even to execute, you're free to even execute. Your law is your law. You're a free vassal state within this empire, and that's big liberty. I'm giving you big liberty with what you do. Executed, whether death or banishment or confiscation of goods or imprisonment. Blessed be the Lord, the God of our fathers, who has put such a thing in the king's heart, to adorn the house of the Lord which is in Jerusalem. So, you see God's sway, God's hand, I like to say providence. That's my word. God's providence, right? Go ahead, Sam. No, it was not unique to Israel. Was not unique to Israel. And the Romans, we see it from a very Jewish, Israeli, Christian standpoint, but this was not unique. The Persians were big about doing that, and the Romans were big about doing that. We talk about Herod's temple at the time of Jesus, but the Romans built a lot of temples to appease people, put them on their side. That was a good way to make people happy. Let's build them a temple to their whatever god, and let's make them happy people so they don't try to revolt against the empire. So, no, it wasn't just Israel. Even though we see it, of course, from the Bible, we uniquely see it as from a Jewish standpoint. But that's obviously, no, not the case altogether. Maybe more here? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, but definitely they encouraged the return of people to make these vassal states within the empire. So I think it was easier to control them that way, because it was such a big kingdom. And I think it was just easier if you could say, oh, well, you guys got this area, and you just pay us our tax, and you can have your little thing and do your little thing, and everybody's happy. And you can do your little thing, and everybody's happy. And if anybody gets out of line, we're going to come rain down on you. But, it was big. And it took so long for news to travel, and it was so hard to enforce a large border that you kind of had to have these, you would call it, vassal states. I mean, that's what they are, vassal states that basically are under the empire, but they still kind of have a lot of free governing will. So I think it was efficient, if you want to look at it that way. And it existed in Rome. Same thing in Rome. Herod, the three Herods, tetrarchs, same type of thing. You had kings in the Roman Empire in these vassal states to govern. So I don't think it was, just to one nation. Send his loving kindness as counselors. I gather the leading men of Israel to go with me. So these are the heads of their fathers. We're not going to get into that. The genealogies. A lot of people. Lots and lots of people. It's important. It tells you how many, tells you families, tribes, lineage. To be a Jew, you had to have lineage. People knew those things. So they take all these people, they assemble the river, camp for 3 days. I observed the people, the priests, did not find the Levites there. So I sent for Eliezer, Ariel, Shema. What's the difference between, he says the priests, but he didn't find the Levites. What's the difference? I thought the Levites were the priests. Is that? The priests are of what tribe? Gary has the answer. The priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. So there's two groups. So there's Levites, and then there's priests that are also Levites. Okay, if that makes any sense. Not all Levites were priests. But there are lineages of Levites that are priestly lineages. So that's kind of how that works. So sometimes we think of that Levitical tribe. That was the issue with Christ, right? Was how can he be a high priest when he's not a Levite? He's a Judah, from the tribe of Judah, and that's what most of Hebrews is about that conundrum, How can Jesus be a priest and a king? How can he be a Judah guy and yet be a priest? Because a priest should be a Levite. So how can the Judah king, Jesus, be the high priest if he's not Levitical? And that's what a lot of Hebrews is about. If you've ever read Hebrews and he talks about the order of Melchizedek, that's what he's saying. Melchizedek was priest and king of Jerusalem. I'm getting off subject, but was a conundrum with the Jews and Christ. That was a conundrum, right? If you got a king, Judah tribe king, how can he be a priest? Because a priest has to be a Levite. And so that's why the Hebrew writer, writing to these Jews, was trying to argue the point that Jesus can be your priest and your king. That was, anyway, off track, but that's how come that comes into play later on. So he says, so he's bringing the ministers. He's got all this stuff. And I think that's a big kind of a problem, He's got a lot of stuff, and he's got to get it there. And he's got to go through a lot of land and time to do that. So he proclaims a fast for a safe journey, all our possessions, because it's scary. These are you're under the Persian Empire, but, it's a big place, and there's a lot of bad people. And, there's warlords, there's people who would come take it. You got a lot of wealth, all this gold, all this silver, all these gold utensils and things for the temple, and you've got all these things, and you're not really warriors, right? So you're going across this land, so you're worried. And he says, I was ashamed to request troops from the king and horsemen to protect us from the enemy, because we had said to the king, the hand of our God is favorable disposed to all those who seek him. His power and his anger against all those who forsake him. So we fasted and sought our God concerning this matter. We listened to our entreaty, and I set apart 12 leading priests. So he says, I was ashamed to ask him, I said, God will take care of us. And if I go and ask him for horsemen and armies to protect us, then that doesn't seem like I have very much faith. But on the other hand, God had never come directly to Ezra and said, I'm going to take care of you and give you a safe trip. So he's scared. I would be scared. I think we all would be scared. And he wants to entreat God's favor before he, and that's something we see with Nehemiah, this entreating the favor of God. And I think it's a powerful lesson for us to entreat God's favor in what we do. Take time to ask God, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Am I doing the right thing? Take time for God to act. And that's what Ezra's doing. He's taking time. And then he separates his loot, right? In other words, don't ever put all your eggs in one basket. That's what my granny used to say, right? If you got a bunch of eggs, you need at least 3 baskets, right? Don't ever put all your eggs in one basket. And that's what he's doing. He's separating his bounty. 12 ways. Weighs it out. To each of these 12, he weighs it out. And he says, that way, y'all are each going to be responsible for this amount of this, what we're taking. A lot of wealth. You're holy to the Lord. The utensils are holy. The silver and the gold are a free will offering to the Lord. Watch and keep them until you weigh them before the leading priest. I think that's important. He says, we're going to weigh this out when we get there. You know, I'm giving you all this stuff, but when we get to Jerusalem, we're going to weigh it. Better be there. Didn't say what was going to happen if it wasn't there, but you get the idea. Better be there. So we're going to weigh it out. We're going to take it over there. We're going to go to the house of the Lord. So they did all this stuff. They got this. They came to Jerusalem. On the 4th day, they weighed it out, made sure it's all there. So they've made the trip. They're safe. The stuff's there. Everything's good. Everything's accounted for. The weight was recorded at the time. Then here's your exiles who had come from the captivity that came, offerings made, delivered the king edicts to the king's satraps, to the governor's province beyond the river. So they're giving the king's orders to all the people on this side of the Jordan. Say, we're here. This is what he said we can do. This is what we're going to do. We got all this stuff done. Now we're going to start doing what we're supposed to be doing. But then they say, oh, but hold on a minute. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. We've got problems in Jerusalem, right? It was all going too good. That's kind of how my week's been. I thought it was all going good, and then it wasn't. It's all going good. Your mother-in-law's house burns down. Everything changes. Anyway, but so when we get to Jerusalem, we're like, this isn't good. We've got this problem. We've got Canaanites and Hittites and Perizzites and Jebusites and Ammonites and Moabites and the Egyptians and the Amorites. For they've taken daughters and they've intermingled. And even the princes and the rulers have done this. And they've been unfaithful to the Lord because they've done this stuff. And I tore my garment and I pulled hair from my head. These people really knew how to lament. You know what? I mean, have you ever noticed that in the Old Testament? We just don't have a fathom about how to do that. These people really knew how to lament. You know, we talk about lamenting. Boy, these people knew how to do it. I mean, they tore their clothes. They put on sackcloth. They put ashes on themselves, tore their hair out of their head. I mean, they could do it, right? We don't have a clue how to do this kind of lamenting, but they could really do it, and he was. And this tells you his heart. He's so, and maybe that's our problem. Maybe things don't bother us deeply as they should. He was deeply bothered. He's been reading the law, studying the law, and now he says, oh, we're not supposed to marry. We're not supposed to intermarry. And then he goes, well, we've done this all over. And he was distraught. And his heart was tore up because of what had happened. And he was appalled, he said. I was appalled, right? How could you do this? Isn't that, do we ever feel that deeply about, when I read this, I'm like, he felt so deeply about God, so deeply about God and what God wanted, that when he knew that God had been cast to the side, he was broken. It broke him. And I just think sometimes we should be broken. I think sometimes we can learn a lot from these people in the Old Testament about what it means to truly be broken, truly be distraught over things that happen. And you just see this here. And he sets, to the evening offering. He says, I sat appalled until the evening offering. But then I arose from my humiliation, even with my garment and my robe torn. I fell on my knees and stretched out my hands to the Lord. And I said, oh, my God, I'm ashamed and embarrassed to lift up my face to you, my God. For our iniquities have risen above our heads, and our guilt has grown even to the heavens. You know, he just can't believe that they've wandered so far from God. And how do you get back, right? Problem is, this is tough. There's no easy way back. You've got wives and children. You've intermarried. How are you going to fix this, right? What are you going to do? Is it okay? Is it going to be all right? What are we going to do? Well, it's rough. And I think we probably would almost have a hard time wrapping our head around how rough it gets. But it's an interesting parallel in Scripture. This point of history, and Gary did Zechariah. God hates divorce, Zechariah. And then at the same time, the contemporary, Zechariah is a contemporary of Ezra, and at the same time, Ezra's over here saying, we got to get rid of all these foreign women, all these foreign men, all these foreign marriages. How are you going to do that? Right? You're going to divorce them. You're going to cast them out. And I've heard preachers get up and preach on marriage and divorce, and they pull that up and say, God hates divorce. And at the same time, I'm thinking, but Ezra's sending hundreds of people that aren't Jews off out of the city to purify the nation at the same time that Zechariah is writing. I always think that's kind of an interesting conundrum in the Bible. And Ezra's doing this not because God per se comes down to Ezra and says, Ezra, you're going to do it. He's doing it because that's what he reads in God's law. I mean, it's the reading of the law that's making him do what he does. It's not, you see, and for us, that's how we are. It's the reading of the Scripture that makes us do what we want, do what we do. It's not that God sits down to you and me and points and puts his finger on us and says, Rex, you need to do this, right? We read it, and then it convicts us to action, and that's what happens here. Ezra's read the law, Ezra studied the law, and now he's convicted to action. But now he's in a really tough pickle, right? Because this is a big thing. He says, we've borne great guilt, and it's no wonder that you've done what you've done to us. This is Rex's paraphrase. It's no wonder you've done what you've done, right? I mean, look at us. We're a mess, right? We've sinned. We've transgressed you. We haven't kept your commandments. We haven't done anything you said to do. And then we get all upset when you come and carry us off into captivity. But that's what we deserve, right? You're just doing what you should do because we're an insolent people. We're rebellious, right? What else are you going to do with us? And he says, we are slaves, yet in our bondage, he didn't forsake us. He should have, but he didn't. And he's given us loving kindness with the kings of Persia. But we're a mess, right? We're a mess. And I can understand, God, why you did all those things that you did. I don't know if you read all that on that, but that's kind of Rex's take on it. And then he says, restore its ruins, give us a wall. That's Nehemiah, not Ezra, because Nehemiah's here at the same time Ezra's here now. This is getting late. What shall we say? We have forsaken your commandments. The land which you're entering to possess is unclean land with uncleanness of peoples in the lands, their abominations filled to end, and their impurity. Do not give your daughters to their sons, nor take their daughters to your sons, and never seek their peace or their prosperity. In other words, don't seek the peace of the nations around you, the prosperity of the nations around you. Rely on God for your peace and your prosperity, that you may be strong and eat the good things of the land, the promises of God. It says, you, our God, have requited us less than our iniquities deserve, and have given us an escaped remnant as this. In other words, this is way more than we deserve. To again break your commandments and intermarry with the peoples who commit these abominations? Would you not be angry with us to the point of destruction? Until there is no remnant, nor any who escape? In other words, if we don't turn, if we don't repent, if we don't do something different, then why wouldn't you just wipe us from the face of the earth? Why would you even bother with us anymore? If we can't follow your law this time, the second time after this captivity, if we can't do it now, then why would you even mess with us? Why would you just wipe us off the face of the earth? So Ezra's like, we got to do something, right? We can't just keep transgressing this law. But you've got all these people who are intermarried. And he says, you're righteous, but we're not. And how can we stand before you? Because we're still in a state of guilt. You see? In other words, unrepentant sin, right? We're still in a state of guilt. So these people come, and they're bitterly weeping. Ezra's upset. Some of them are also convicted. But they said there's hope in spite of this. But we're going to put away all these foreign women and children. And we're going to have to do it according to the law. It seems like this is one of those places in the Bible that you kind of just, so we're going to get rid of all these women, all these children. We're going to just kick them out. Because we should have never done this in the first place. Very difficult portion of Scripture, I would say. Wouldn't you? God doesn't say don't, right? God says don't do it. They're convicted. So he says, we took an oath. Let's all get together. Right? Within 3 days, council, assembly, men, Judah, Benjamin. Within the 3 days, 9th month, open square. Ezra the priest stood up and said to them, you've been unfaithful and have married foreign wives, adding to the guilt of Israel. Now therefore make confession. Separate yourselves from the peoples of the land, from the foreign wives. Then all the assembly replied with a loud voice, that's right, as you have said. So it is our duty to do. But there are many people. It is a rainy season. We're not able to stand in the open, nor can this task be done in 1 or 2 days. We have transgressed greatly. Which gives you an idea of how many people we're talking about. So you're going to have to get rid of them, right? All these wives, all these children that aren't Israelites, Jewish, because that's what God said to do, and you polluted the land. And now we're going to turn back. We're going to repent. We're going to make it right. But, man, the cost to turn this thing back to the right is, I think, hard for me to fathom a little bit. Problem is, when we wander so far away from God, I think, the moral of the story, maybe, is that the further you wander away from God, the more it costs you to come back. I think that's maybe the message of the book, right? The further you wander away, the more it costs you to come back. And they had wandered a long ways from God. And God was righteous. God told them what to do. They were carried off into captivity. They married outside of there, and I'm sure not all of them put their wives away. I'm sure some of them didn't. I'm sure some of them left Jerusalem instead of doing that. I'm sure some did, maybe a lot. But it's fascinating, isn't it, that at the same time, Zechariah says God hates divorce. The same contemporary, God says, right? Kind of interesting, I think. And so the decision's made. We're going to do this. I think it's a sad part of the Bible. I also think it's another place we see, as in the book of Esther. We see a real hard line being drawn. You wonder, I do, in the Old Testament, is there grace and mercy outside of Jerusalem, outside of Israel? Probably not. Interestingly, they didn't say if you can proselyte them to Judaism, if you can convert them to Judaism. That doesn't seem to be on the table here. It just seems to be lineage, nationality, race. It's ethnicity, if you want to look at it that way. He selected men, their father's household, so they convened on the first day, investigate the matter. They finished investigating all the men who had married foreign wives by the first day of the first month. They pledged to put away their wives, being guilty. They offered a ram of the flock for their offense. Of the sons of Immer, there were several, as you see, who did this because it was necessary for them to come back. And yes, I will. So on a sad note tonight, I end our class. I think it's a sad note, sad time in history, maybe. But they're looking for the hope of God, the hope of righteousness. And I think, like I said, they had transgressed so far away, it was just difficult. At what point do you turn back, and how do you do that? And how do you get God's favor? Because God's been kind to you. So I'll let you wrestle with the moral issues and the issues of heart with this lesson. And Sunday morning we will talk about Nehemiah on the wall, which is a lot more bright. Thanks for your time this evening.